Well, voters in Great Britain head back to the polls on Thursday for the third time in about 5 years. The election campaign has become mostly a battle between two leaders over who can bring an end to 3 years of uncertainty over Brexit, the decision to withdraw from the European Union. The polls suggest a win for the Conservatives, but the gap has been narrowing in recent days. Catherine Barnard is a professor of EU law and employment at the University of Cambridge. She joins me now. Professor Barnard, good to speak with you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me. What is the ballot box question for voters in this election? What are they being asked to choose?
Well, it's always been billed as a Brexit election, but in fact, as is the case with all elections, it's a mixed bag. People want to talk about the health service, the NHS, and also about education, particularly about schools and other public services. But the Conservatives have managed to say, well, if we get Brexit done, there will be more money for these things, and therefore one thing automatically leads to another. The Labour Party, on the other hand, say we are the party of public services, and actually doing Brexit in the very hard way that the Conservatives are advocating means that there'll be less money for public services, not more. So actually we're going to renegotiate a new Brexit deal, and that will do much less harm to the economy, and then we'll have a referendum.
Let's drill down on that a little bit. What message has the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, been giving the voters on Brexit? What's his pledge?
Get Brexit done. I mean, it's this incredibly powerful message, a bit like in the referendum itself, take back control. It's that same three-word moniker, get Brexit done, immensely appealing for its simplicity. But behind that great simplicity is levels of complexity that the general public absolutely are not being having explained to them. They just think it will all be done on the 31st of January. The world will move on and we can talk about something else. They're in for a really rude awakening.
I want to come back to some of that in just a moment in terms of what happens after Brexit if we get that. What about the main rival, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn? What's his message been on how he will deal with all the uncertainty over Brexit?
Well, his message is to his supporters nuanced, to his detractors confused. And his message is quite complicated because he has a party which is very split. In the north of England, you have a lot of Leave voting constituencies who've traditionally been Labour territory. And of course, they want Brexit done. But in the more metropolitan areas, so the big cities, London, Liverpool, Manchester, those are people who are broadly Remain voting and they don't want Brexit done. And so he has had to be riding both horses. And this has led to this either nuanced or confused message, depending on whether you're a supporter or a detractor.
What kind of campaign has it been in terms of the voters? What's the mood of the voters in Great Britain?
I think there's a great deal of weariness and wariness. Now, there's something very practical. We haven't had an election in December since the 1920s. And there's a good reason for that. It's cold and it's wet. And in some areas it snows, and unlike in Canada, when it snows in the UK, everything grinds to a halt. And so canvassers have been reluctant to go out, and people have been reluctant to open their doors to people canvassing for the parties. But I think generally there is a handful of people who are excited, but most people are feeling pretty wary because they really don't like what they see on either side of the political divide. And so the question is, are they going to vote for the least bad option? And then the question is, will they vote on tribal lines, Labour Conservative, or will they vote more on Leave Remain lines, in which case Conservatives very obviously for Leave and Labour become sort of de facto more for Remain.
What do the polls tell us about the likely outcome?
Polls showed about 3 weeks ago very significant lead for the Conservatives, but that lead has been reducing. The polls from yesterday were suggesting actually Boris Johnson might have something of a lead of about 21 votes, which means he doesn't have the great majority he's hoping for. It won't be quite a hung parliament, but the risk is that he won't be able to get things done in the way that he had intended. And of course, if Labour cooperate with the SNP, the Scottish National Party, and with the Lib Dems, and possibly the all-important DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, that's the Northern Ireland party, which supported Theresa May's government. It may be that they could vote down any legislation from Boris Johnson. But the reality is all of this is within the margin of error. Nobody quite knows. But what we are seeing is that the very strong lead that the Conservatives had a couple of weeks ago is being reduced.
The Conservatives have suggested if they do win, they can get a new trade deal done with the EU by the end of next year, 2020. What are your thoughts on the likelihood of that?
Well, I mean, anyone who's had any experience of trade negotiations just says this is for the birds. If you remember the trade deal that Canada has got with the EU, depending on how you count, it took between 7 and 10 years. Now, the UK says, well, we already start from a position of alignment with the EU, so it'll be much easier than any trade deal that Canada did. But that misses the point, because never before has a trade agreement been negotiated where states are coming apart rather than getting closer together. And there is very little template for anything of that sort. That's problem one. Problem two is that the UK says not only will we do a comprehensive trade deal with the EU, but we'll also do one with China, with the US, with Australia, New Zealand, possibly Canada at the same time. And this requires incredible resource that the UK doesn't have.
Always good to get your perspective. Professor Catherine Barnard joining us this evening. UK election tomorrow. Thanks so much for your time. Take care. We'll talk again.